Okay, good morning again here at Bible Baptist Church. Take your Bibles, go to the book of Matthew. Let's find chapter 5. We'll look at verses 43 to 48. Matthew, chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. One more time, Matthew. Find chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. Long time ago was 1958, okay? This guy named Dr. Norman Pettinger, okay, in the issue of the Christian Century, okay, he conducted a critique of C.S. Lewis. You guys have heard of C.S. Lewis, okay? And he criticized Lewis. He said that Lewis didn't care enough for the Sermon on the Mount, which is what I'm preaching out of today, okay? So Lewis responded to Dr. Pettinger, and he said, as for caring for the Sermon on the Mount, if caring means liking or enjoying it, he said, I suppose no one cares for it. He said, who can like being knocked flat on his face by a sledgehammer? He said, I can hardly imagine a more deadly spiritual condition than that of a man who can read that passage, he said, with tranquil pleasure. Okay, so for Lewis, that was a perfect comeback, okay? It was an accurate statement. For the Sermon on the Mount, you know what? It's going to affect any serious believer. It really is. Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, and he started out with these 8 Beatitudes. Okay, 8 Beatitudes. I mentioned when I first started this sermon series here that we don't cherry pick and say I'm a Christian and we pick one. If you're a Christian, you're all 8. So he started out with 8 blesseds and said, you need to be them all. They were like 8 successive blows. And, those things will cause you to question the seriousness of your faith, okay? But then Jesus followed up with a couple of metaphors. And those metaphors were that we were supposed to be salt and light to the world, okay? Salt and light to the world. Salt and light to a dark world. Okay, and of course, salt and light, when a room's dark and a light comes on, of course, it brings light into the room. And the salt's a preservative. But having hit us with those 8 Beatitudes there, and then that salt and light metaphor, those 2 metaphors there, this is what he told his followers. Because don't forget, he's preaching to thousands of people. This is the Sermon on the Mount. He's on a hillside looking down at all of his followers. The religious leaders are out there. And he said in chapter 5, verse 20, that unless their righteousness and our righteousness today surpass that of the Pharisees, that's the religious leaders of that day, and the teachers of the law, he said, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he just told the people in this sermon here that unless their righteousness was above that of the religious leaders, they weren't getting into the kingdom of heaven. Wow, that's a pretty high reach. And then what he did was he followed it up with 6 illustrations of what our righteousness should be like. Okay, if it's to surpass that of the righteousness of the Pharisees. Okay, 6 illustrations of what our righteousness should be like. Each incredibly demanding. Each impossible to achieve in our own strength. So almost every line of this sermon, if it's taken to the heart, will seem impossible. You know what? There was this preacher, Alexander White. He's a Scottish preacher, famous guy. He's a preacher at the end of the 1800s and the 1900s, and I know that was a long time ago. But, he tells a story about when he was a little boy. He's a little boy, he broke his arm. So you say, well, little boys break their arm. What they were going to do with this little boy named Alexander White is they were going to take him to the hospital. They were going to take that arm off. That's right, because that's how bad it was. So this neighborhood lady said that she would take him and nurse him back to health. In other words, you don't have to go to the hospital. You don't have to lose your arm. She'll nurse him back to health. So as she was nursing him back to health, I want to tell you that his arm was in intense pain. That's why they wanted to take it off at the hospital. But as he would be in agony and he would be in pain, the woman would say to the little boy, Alexander White, I like the pain. I like the pain. because that meant that he had feeling in his arm. And that meant that it was healing. So he's in pain, but she's saying, I like the pain. So later on, when Alexander White was preaching, okay, and he'd be preaching like I'm going to preach today, he'd be preaching his message, and he would look at people like you, and he would say, I like the pain. I like the pain, okay? So, you know what? I say all that because in a similar way, we should like the pain of the Sermon on the Mount and the challenges. Because if you're really taking this serious, and if you're a serious Christian, you really think about it, Jesus was asking us to take things to heart. A lot of times in those days, the religious leaders, everything was peripheral. They would quote the Old Testament, and then they would do an interpretation of it, but it wasn't from the heart. You know, things like, you may not have committed adultery, but if you've looked at a woman wrong, you've done it, you've committed adultery in your heart. Those things are challenging. So we should take the Sermon on the Mount very serious. Take the pain and grow from it. I mean, the challenges, if you really look at them and you really ask yourself challenging questions about yourself, it can be a little discouraging. Okay? But at the same time, few passages can be more encouraging. Actually, Jesus is paying us a tremendous compliment by asking us to do this stuff. You know why? He wouldn't ask us unless he thought we could do it. He wouldn't challenge us with these passages unless he thought we could do it. So he's preaching this Sermon on the Mount to the people on the hillside, and I've been sharing little passages with you from week to week so that we can progressively grow in our faith. And that we might manifest all the characteristics that are brought out here in the Sermon on the Mount. That they might become evident in our life. If we're truly to be that salt and light, that they would be evident in our life. So Jesus believed that we could reflect the extraordinary calling of these messages. In our text today, we're going to look at the sixth example of how to live a righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees or religious leaders of that day. We're on the last one, number 6. And the great commandment today is to love. To love. The Lord gives us instructions today as to how to build a growing love into our lives. Look at verse 43 if you would with me. He says he's looking out down from the hill at the thousands out there, to include the religious leaders. He says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor. By the way, just pause for a minute. The people who were saying these things were often the religious leaders because they were the people teaching the people of that day. But he says, anyways, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Then he goes on, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? And then he just closes with, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So, in these 6 illustrations of living above the righteousness of the Pharisees, he starts out as he often does, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That was the traditional thinking. Okay, that was the traditional thinking of the religious establishment of that day, and that's what they would have taught the people. That was the way the man on the street in that day, the average Jewish man, was taught to think. But is that what the Old Testament actually said? Because the religious leaders are supposed to be teaching the people the Old Testament. I want to tell you right now that in the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18 said, love your neighbor as yourself. It said, love your neighbor as yourself. But the hate your enemy part was never there. That wasn't in the Old Testament. That was an add-on. Okay? So that would make you ask yourself a question, well, if it wasn't there, well, why did they add on the hate your enemy part? Well, I'm just going to tell you, the religious people of that day, the religious leaders, no doubt were convinced that their neighbors, of course, who would their neighbors have been? They would have thought, our neighbors, of course, are our fellow Jews. We're all Jews. Our neighbors are the Jews. Therefore, this idea of extending love to anybody else would have been a foreign thought to them. Love your neighbor. Well, our neighbors are the Jews. Not the other people. Particularly the foreigners. You know, the land they took over there, the land of the Canaanites. The very people who God basically said to eliminate from the land, they shouldn't have even been there if they'd obeyed God, but they were. So, and by the way, when God told them to eliminate them from the land, that was a judicial command from the Lord. You know, that's before the Israelites ever got to the land. He said, when you go in there, and he said, wipe out all the people there. But if you look at Genesis 15:16, he didn't allow them to go into the land for quite some time. Actually, he didn't allow them to go into the land for 4 more generations of people. Because he said the sin of the Amorites has not reached its fulfillment. Okay, meaning that God was giving them time to repent and change. But when they didn't, God said, when you go in there, these people are evil. He basically said to wipe them out. Well, you know, flash ahead to the Sermon on the Mount, there's still Canaanite people living in the land because they didn't wipe them out. So in Jewish, but anyways, the religious leaders' minds and thought, it's us Jews and then there's everybody else. So love our neighbors, the Jews, and then hate everybody else. And the other reason that they might have taught the hate part was, you know what, when you express a positive, usually there's a negative corollary that goes with it. Okay? I mean, that's kind of a silly reason, okay? But the love your neighbor part, which is the positive part, invites the negative part, which is, well, if it's not your neighbor, then that's, you know, then we'll hate the person who's not your neighbor or the enemy. Okay? So that's kind of the positive, negative thinking, okay? And, but in adopting that negative teaching, okay, they set aside other Old Testament passages, because there were other Old Testament passages that taught kindness toward one's enemy. I mean, think of Exodus in chapter 23. Think of verses 4 and 5. That Jesus was teaching the Israelites about the laws of justice and mercy. So in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 23 in Exodus, he says, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey, get that? That was your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you has fallen down under its load, he said, do not leave it there. Be sure to help him with it. Okay? So, somebody you hate, his donkey falls down, help him with the donkey. So, surely they were aware of Solomon's counsel. You know, Solomon is supposed to be the wisest guy that ever lived. Proverbs 25:21. He said, if your enemy, there's your enemy again, if your enemy's hungry, you know what you're supposed to do? Solomon says, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, guess what you do? You give him water to drink. So, by the time Jesus is preaching this, though, the Jewish leaders had let their emotions get the best of them. And you know what they were doing? They were honoring God. We should honor God, right? But they were honoring God by hating anyone who wasn't Jewish. They'd come a long way down. So the standard of love in Jesus' day, when he shared these words and he looked out at that crowd on the hill there, was that I will love only my neighbor, my fellow Jew, and I'm going to hate everybody else. That was the standard. That was their duty. I mean, talk about discrimination. Okay. I mean, can I say it this way? There was nobody who was a Gentile vacationing in Palestine. Okay, if you were on vacation and you were a Gentile, you didn't go to Palestine. That's where all the Jews were. So the traditional teaching on love by the religious leaders of the day was a very limited love. Love the Jews and hate everybody else. Jesus brought new teaching here. He says, but I tell you, and this is verse 44, but I tell you, love your enemies. And pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. The New King James translation says, bless those who curse you. Do good for those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you or persecute you. So, some add on there what it is. That's that little add on of what it is to love and to pray for them. This was new teaching from Jesus. And the fact that the text mentions enemies and that it's plural tells you that their enemies were presently doing them harm. Okay, he made it. He said your enemies, plural. They're presently doing you harm. What amazing teaching! The man on the street, the idea of loving somebody's enemy, that would have seemed absurd. It went against your natural sense of basically what was right or what was wrong. Okay. But under the Old Testament law, the idea of loving one's enemy was completely contrary to their perception of God's law, which they thought required rejection and hatred of enemies. In other words, it was a limited love. Jesus was commanding here. He was basically commanding a love without limits. He said, you need to love everybody. Love everybody, listen to this, despite what they say or do to you. Are you liking it now? You guys got to love everybody despite what they say or do to you. That was kind of countercultural back then, okay? Jesus wasn't telling them here to love the evil they do. He didn't tell them that. But he did say to love them. Love the enemy. Don't love what they do, but love them. Well, there's some application there for us. Application for today. We don't have to always like the things people do to us, but Jesus would want us to love them. Do you know that? They might say something about you. You still got to love them. They might do something to you. Jesus says you still got to love them. So where's the application in that? Well, Jesus is telling us to look beyond the treatment we're receiving. You may not like the treatment you receive. Jesus says to you, I want you to love them anyways. Oh. Jesus is also saying you may not be in agreement with them. You don't need agreement with them, basically. I want you to love them anyways. And he also said here we're supposed to pray for them. So true love, if it's true love, it prays for them. It prays against all odds. So why does Jesus tell us, like he was telling the people in the text, that we have to have that kind of love? Why? Well, he told us in verse 45, the very first part of the verse, so that we can be children of our Father in heaven. Yeah. He said, when you love like that, you're a child. You're like a child of your Father in heaven. Which implies that's the way he loves. That you may be children of your Father in heaven, which is the Hebrew way of saying that you'll be like your Father in heaven. So you say that ought to ask us the question, well, what's he like? Jesus explained here. What's our Father in heaven like? He said here in verse 45, the second half of the verse, he says, he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. Do you know when the sun came up today, and it is out there today, that it rose on the evil and the good? And it's not doing it today, but it did the other day. And he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. I think the illustration there would be is you need to have your crops watered. So he sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So the same sun comes up over the righteous and the evil, and the same rain comes down on the righteous and the unrighteous. So you and I should just say, wow, okay. God shines his rain and his blessings on both the righteous people and the unrighteous people. God doesn't just cause his sun to shine on the righteous and his rain to fall on the righteous or their crops. No. He causes it also to fall on the unrighteous. Or in this case, in the text here, the people who are Jewish. And I'll let you decide who the unrighteous are today. So he causes the sun to shine out and the rain to come down on both the good and the wicked. Here's the point. When we love everybody, we become like Jesus. We become like our Father in heaven. We don't do it by sending the sun and the rain, because you and I can't do that. But we do it by impartiality, when we basically, we just, listen to this, we choose to love. We choose to love everybody. Not just our friends, not just our close family, but even people out there that, well, we might actually call them our enemies. We just choose to love them. Jesus is calling them, and he's calling you and me to love without limits. But if we love without limits, guess who we're being like? We're being like our Father in heaven. Look at verse 46. Jesus tells us that this love here distinguishes us from the rest of the world. Verse 46. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? They wouldn't have missed it. They wouldn't have missed Jesus' point there. Okay? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly fond of the tax collector today. Okay? He seems to come to my house every January or so and hits me pretty hard. Okay? But I just want you to know something. The tax collector today is nothing like the tax collector of this day here. Because we're talking about the days when the Romans were in charge here, and the Romans had their own tax system set up. And guess what? The Jewish people, they despised the tax collectors. They despised the tax collectors because these tax collectors were hired by the Romans to collect taxes from a certain geographic area. And there was a certain amount of taxes from that area they were supposed to collect. So the tax collectors were Jews hired by the Romans, and they went and they collected that tax. Not only did they collect that tax, but they collected a little bit extra. But the little bit extra never got to the Romans. So the tax collectors became rich, you'll understand this word, crooks. And these tax collectors in that day, they were hated by everybody, especially by the Jews. And they were hated because also they were employees of the Gentiles. They were Jewish men working for the Gentile Romans. Jesus says here, love many ways. Wow. Love many ways. His point is that these disgusting, double-crossing tax collectors, who they love. You know who they loved? They loved their fellow tax collectors, their tax collecting buddies. So if a person loves only his friends, is he doing any better than a swindling tax collector? If you love only your friends, you're not doing any better than these swindling tax collectors because they love each other. You love your friends. You know why you love your friends? Because they reciprocate your love. Right? Does it make sense? Big deal, Jesus is saying. Even the Jewish tax collectors love each other. So he double emphasized his point. In verse 47 he says, and if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Let me read that one more time. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Jesus was telling them, if you're going to be my followers, you need to do more than what is common among non-believers. Do more than what is common among believers in the way non-believers in the way they show love. Here's the thing, if you're a Christian, our spirit, the spirit of the Christian, heartfelt Christian love, we're supposed to do more. We're supposed to do something that the natural man who doesn't know Jesus Christ doesn't understand. We're supposed to be doing more. That somebody who doesn't know Jesus, they just can't understand. They can't do it. And what Jesus is asking us to do that the average person won't do is he's asking us to love our enemies. Love the people that are hard to love. So the question that we might need to ask is there, listen to this, is there a more to our love? Is there a more to our love? Is there something about my love that can't be explained in natural terms? Is there something unique or special about my love for other people that isn't present in the life of anybody else out there? In other words, I'm supposed to be a Christian. Is there something special about my love that's different than the average person out there? A person who doesn't even know Jesus. They're not a Christian. Is there a more to my love, or is my love just like theirs? That's what Jesus is saying in the text. If your love is just like everybody else's, then you're just like the pagans in the tax collectors, because they love each other. And then you're like the people who love their friends because their friends love them back. Jesus, I want you to go above that. I want you to have a more to your love. I want you to love everybody. So, those questions we're supposed to ask ourselves, is there a more to our love? Those are important questions. The reason it's an important question is because if there's not a more to our love, if we love only those with whom we have something in common, people who treat us well, if there's nothing more than that, maybe we're not even Christians at all. We're just like everybody else. Now, notice that I didn't say that we must perfectly exhibit this more to our love. We don't have to perfectly exhibit this more to our love. But it still goes back to the question, is there a more? Is there anything? Is there a more? This is a great call from God here. It's a great call from Jesus. It's a higher call. And the call is he wants us to be like him. We need to live like this. And how we live is what verse 44 says. We need to love people we consider our enemies. So, last question. How are we going to do this? How are we to do this? First of all, I want you to notice in the text here, Jesus doesn't ask us to love them the way we love our loved ones. I'm talking about our family, okay? Those closest and nearest to us. He's not asking us to love them like that. I mean, because you know what? Think about your family, those that are closest to you. That kind of love, that should be spontaneous. That should just be instinctive. That should be natural. It should just happen. So that's not what he's asking us to do. Loving your family, I hope it's just natural for you. You shouldn't have to make an effort to love your family. You should just do it. So he's not asking us to do that. He's certainly not asking us to have a romantic love with our enemies. Romantic love. He's not asking us to have a romantic love. He's not asking us to have a buddy love, a family love, an emotional love. Not asking us to have any of those kinds of loves for our enemies. But you know what he is asking us to do as it relates to our enemies? He's asking us to have something called agape love. Yeah, agape love. That's a Greek word, okay? Agape. What the agape love is agape love is a deliberate, intelligent, determined love. It's deliberate, it's on purpose, it's intelligent, it's thought out, and it's determined. It's focused. So the point is if you have agape love, you make a choice to have goodwill towards somebody else. That's what he's asking us to do. You know what it is to have goodwill. Your intentions toward them need to be good. It's the kind of love that you ask yourself this question, what's in their best interest? And the reason that's important is because if you're asking what's in their best interest, you're basically putting your own best interest or your own self-interest to the side and saying, I'm not happy with them. They're not really my friend. They're my enemies. In fact, they've done whatever they've done or said whatever they've said or affected you and however they've affected you. And Jesus says, I want you to just choose to love them. And the way you love them is you do or interact with them to have their best interest in mind. How do I illustrate that for you? I can illustrate that for you because I love studying World War II, and I think of this Dutch woman named Corrie ten Boom, whose family wound up in the prison camp, and guess what happened to her family? They died in the prison camp. Corrie ten Boom survived, and because she survived, she would go out around and she would speak to people, and she would talk about her experience, and she would go out and she would lecture on grace. You know what grace is? That's what God does for us in our lives. She would lecture on God's grace to us in our lives. I'm sure she talked about how God, even apart from the catastrophes that happened and the loss of her family, she talked about how God worked in her life. Maybe even how God was working in her life of her family before her family was gone. I don't know exactly what her lectures constituted, but I'm trying to picture that. So picture her lecture one day, and all of a sudden at the end of the lecture, somebody comes up to shake her hand. He stands out in front of her, and he goes like this, and guess who it is? It's one of the prison guards from the concentration camp. And he's extending his hand out to this woman. This is post-World War II. She expressed that she had to ask God to help her love him. To find the grace from God and have him help her to reach out and to accept the prison guard's hand. That's love. That's love. That's volitional, intelligent love that says, I will love by the grace and the strength of God, and I'll reach out my hand. I referenced C.S. Lewis earlier. He wrote this series of books, 3 books, Mere Christianity. He says the rule for all of us is perfectly simple. He said, do not waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. He says, don't waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. He said, just act as if you do. Just act as if you do. He said, as soon as we do that, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will come to love them. That's what Lewis said. If you behave like you love them, you're going to come to love them. If you injure someone you dislike, he said, you will find yourself disliking them more. Did you hear that one? So when you do evil or treat somebody wrong, you find yourself becoming more evil or disliking them even more. So if you do it with this term, Lewis says, you'll find yourself disliking him even less than you did, or even more than you did. Lewis said the difference between a Christian and a worldly man is not that the worldly man has only affections or likings. Okay? And that the Christian man has only charity, that agape love. He said the worldly man treats certain people kindly because he likes them. The Christian, trying to treat everyone kindly, you know that love thing, finds himself liking more and more people as he goes on. Did you hear that? The Christian person trying to treat everyone kindly, showing that love, finds himself liking more and more people as he goes on. And Lewis says, including people he could never imagine himself liking. So he's saying, put it into action, you'll start liking them more. There's that key word. It's in the text there, by the way. It's in your verse 47 there. And if you only greet your own people, what are you doing more than others? That's the more. In verse 47. That's more, not schmores. More. Okay? This is the more that makes people different from the believers. I mean, this is the more which makes the believer different from the other people out there in the world. And it's within reach of all of us. We all have the capacity to love like that. You know why? Because the Spirit indwells in us. If you're a Christian who's accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior because He died for your sins on the cross, and you said, I'm going to follow you from now on, Jesus, His Spirit indwells in you. And you have the capacity to love like this. You can love like this. If you're a believer, you're commanded to love like this. That's what Jesus says. So the question you need to ask yourself today is, where do I need to show the more? Is there some place in our life where we need to show the more? There's your question. So how do I wrap it all up today? How am I going to wrap it all up? Well, the first command was to love your enemies. And here's the thing. Love, that's choice. The kind of love we're talking about here, agape love, it's a choice. You got to choose to do it. You got to choose to love people. Yeah, they may have offended you, they may have done whatever they did. You still got to choose to love. So, love your enemies, he says. The other thing was, the second part of that was, he said, pray for them. We got to not only love them, we got to pray for those who persecute us. That's a high call. That's a high call. We got people in government right now that I'm finding it difficult to pray for, but God says I got to do it, so I'm doing it. I consider them persecuting me. No names mentioned, of course. So we got to love them. We got to pray for them. But that's the pinnacle of selfless love. Makes me think of Jesus. He's on the cross. Those big long spiked nails are through his hand. And from the cross in Luke 23, I think it's verse 24, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's agape love. He had their interest in mind. He had our interest in mind, because if we'd been there, we'd have had him on the cross too. He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And he said that on the cross because he had all of humanity's interest in mind. Maybe you got enemies. Listen to this. Maybe you have enemies. Maybe they don't know what they do to you. Or maybe they don't know what they've done to you. Maybe they don't know what they do to you. Maybe they don't know what they've done to you. Put it past tense. But can you pray for them? Pray for them. Don't pray against them. Pray for them. If you can pray against them, that's not what Jesus wants. Pray for them. Because you know what happens when you pray for your enemies? Whether they're those people I'm talking about in government or your personal, in this life enemies that you know. When you do, what you're doing is you're assaulting the throne of grace up there. And you're asking God to do a special work in their life. So you're assaulting the throne of grace and asking God to do a work in the life of somebody who you consider down here, well, can I say it, to be your enemy. But you're assaulting the throne of grace and asking God, help that person. Help that person. That kind of prayer is supernatural, because that's not within our capacity to, when somebody's our enemy, to say, oh Lord, and you're reaching out and saying, would you help this person? And whatever words you would use. But when you pray like that, you know what you're doing? When you pray like that, you might as well be walking in the heavenlies with Jesus. You pray for your enemy, you might as well be walking in the heavenlies with Jesus, because you know what? That's what he would do. That's what he would do. And if you're praying like that and you're walking in the heavenlies with Jesus, you know what's happening to you? Because you're praying for your enemies? You're changing. You are. You're changing. You're praying for if you're praying for somebody you consider your enemy, or somebody who's done to you, and you're assaulting the throne of heaven and all of its grace to work in that person's life, it's you changing also. It'll change you. You pray for your enemy, you'll come to like your enemy. It's impossible to go on praying for somebody without coming to like them. Okay. you might actually come to really love them. That's what Jesus is calling us to do here. You know what? And the people you pray for, they're going to become objects of your conscious love. It's going to come natural. You're going to just start praying for them. I know it's a tough call. I told you the Sermon on the Mount stuff wasn't easy tonight. Rhetorical question: will it be worth it? It will. It will because Jesus said it would. And it will because the struggle will transform you. Who has done you wrong in your life that you've prayed for in the past or you need to pray for now? But it'll be worth it. It'll transform you. And when you pray like that, you know what's going to happen? The angels in heaven, if they can see down here, they're going to look down. You know what they're going to say to one another? They're going to look down at you and say, look, he's a spitting image of his Father in heaven. Or, look, she's the spitting image of her Father in heaven. Wow. Oh, that we could impact the world with the love of Jesus Christ. Amen. Until next week.